Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest hangout. We are some of the authors from spookymiddlegrade.com, and today we're answering questions from Avery Coonley School. We are really excited. We got the chance to Skype with them recently, and they had some leftover questions, so we're going to answer all of those today. And let's see who we have with us. Well, we've got me. Hey, my name is Kim Ventrella. I'm the author of this book, Skeleton Tree, and also Bone Hollow. And Sherry.
Hi, I'm Sherry. I'm under S.A. Larsen, and this is my young adult novel, Marked Beauty, and this is my middle grade novel, Motley Education. Sarah.
And I'm Sarah Cannon, and I'm the author of Oddity, which is a middle grade fantasy novel, and I have a twist coming out in January 2020.
Woo woo! Excited. Party time. Okay, well, we had some really great questions. Our first one comes from Julia, and she wants to know, what was your favorite part of your book to write? And this one is for Sherry or S.A. Larsen.
I really like writing the action, especially because it's got the Norse mythology elements in it, and the kind of weird creatures or what have you. And I like to create a little twist on some of the regular creatures. But I'd say ultimately, at the heart, Motley Education is about finding the courage within yourself. Even though when you know whatever is ahead of you is going to be really hard, you just say, I'm just going to do it anyway. And you're just going to trust that you can do this. And Ebony has a scene with her parents separately. She has an issue with her mom. Her mom has done something in the first book. From a parental point of view, it was to protect Ebony. But Ebony feels like, oh, I'm just a little kid. She didn't trust me. She didn't believe in me, that kind of a thing. And what she ends up learning in this other scene with her dad is that ultimately her courage was within herself anyway. That's where it comes from. And that's where she can learn to build on it. It's not, somebody else doesn't give you the courage. It's in there. You just have to work at it and let it build up. And in order to do that, you have to go through experiences and do things. And so that's why at the end of the book, she charges ahead and does what she has to do. So I think I liked seeing all that come together. And I remember when I first wrote that scene that's closer to the climax with her dad, I was like, oh, that's where I was going this whole time. But I didn't really realize I was going there. So that was kind of cool for me.
Yeah, that's cool. I like when it all comes together in the end too. Definitely my favorite part. Yeah. When you're done, you're like, oh yeah, that's how it works.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, great question. And now Clara has a question for Sarah. Are your characters based on real people?
So I think this is such a fun question, right? Because if you know an author, isn't there this tendency to kind of be like, wow, I hope I didn't do anything that made them crabby and I don't recognize myself in one of these books. But, really, I would say that generally the majority of my characters are not based on real people, but they are based on people that I have found interesting or, people that I have found just to be important parts of any community that I've been a part of. When you write a book and you set it in a specific location, you've got, main characters, but then you've also got this enormous cast of people that are holding the story up and holding the community up. And they may not get much time on camera, right, as it were, in the book, but they really matter because they help you understand the context that your main character and even sometimes your antagonist, your villain, are coming from. And a lot of those people in my books are based on people in my community that have been important to me, or that, my community wouldn't function without them. But I guess I also think it's interesting. Sometimes I'll put a little nod in there. I think I mentioned on a call not that long ago that my grandma once tried to demonstrate a bowling move with a grapefruit and lost it and let go of it, and it went whizzing past my grandpa's head. And this is a legendary story in our family. So in Oddity, there's a woman that has a tendency to go bowling on the streets of the city. And if you're driving a car, this is something you have to watch out for. And that's a complete nod to my grandma. And I did put one of my favorite teachers in Twist because I just couldn't help it. So sometimes, but not usually.
Okay, good to know. Well, if I'm ever in your neighborhood, I will watch out for those grapefruit just like whizzing by and whatnot.
Yeah.
We all need vitamin C this time of year.
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this question is from Mahir, and we're going back to Sarah. How did you come up? You again, you're in the hot seat.
What?
How did you come up with a title for your book?
All right. Well, obviously, the title of Oddity, if you've looked at the book at all, then you know that that's the name of the town that Ada lives in New Mexico. But the reason that the town is named that is because that's the best possible way of describing what it is. I wanted to really let you know what you were in for when you showed up in town because lots of strange things happen there and no one really finds them remarkable. Um, for example, the park is full of giant spiders, right? And they're really scary, but at the same time, they make gorgeous lace. And so going in and carefully harvesting this lace and selling it is an important industry in Oddity. So there are a lot of little things like that that make that a really good name for both the town and the book. And you know, middle grade adventure novels, we're usually tracking down something that doesn't seem quite as it should be. And that's another reason why Oddity is a good name. My book that's coming out in January is called Twist, in part because the main characters are mostly people who write and make art and create things, and then things keep not turning out the way that they expect, right? So when we're watching a show, we're reading a book, and something that happens takes us by surprise, we say, ooh, twist, you know? But it's also set in Oklahoma, and there's a tornado, so that's another really good reason for that title.
Hey, that's where I live. What?
It's not by you right now.
Are you sure? Okay. Okay. That's good. Well, man, love it. Now I really can't wait to read Twist. I had no idea it was set in my own town.
Oh, yeah. You're in OKC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is in Tulsa. I spent a lot of my middle grade years in Tulsa.
You did? Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I'm very excited. Okay, so finally, I guess it's my turn in the hot seat. Okay, I think I'm ready. This is from Krish. When you are establishing conflict in your story, what should you look out for and fix? So this was a tough one. I made little bullet points for myself and everything. The first thing that I think you should look out for that maybe you're not establishing your conflict as strongly as you could is if your character isn't the one directing the action. So your character should be the one who is making all of the hard choices. And when there's some big obstacle that comes up, hopefully your main character is the one who's overcoming it. Now, they might get help from other people. They might learn things along the way from some secondary characters, but they should be the one directing the action. And especially what you don't want is if you're writing middle grade and your main character is a kid, you don't want adults to swoop in and then solve all of the problems for them. You want them to solve their own problems. Number two, sometimes your conflict can be a little too impersonal. So, for example, if you had a story that, you know, your school was overrun with zombies, that could be really scary. But if nothing directly affects your main character, then it's still not going to be that interesting. You want it to be really personal to your main character. So not only is your school overrun with zombies, but maybe your main character's best friend is turned into a zombie. And so now it's very close to them and they have to deal directly with that. Or maybe they're turned into a zombie or, you know, something like that. So make sure it's personal to your main character. And number three, so you can have different types of conflict. It could be something outside that's happening, like the zombies, or something inside. So maybe, you know, your character is dealing with emotions. They were bullied and they have to learn how to stand up for themselves or something like that. But whatever it is, you have to make sure it's big enough to carry an entire story. So a question that you can ask yourself is, about the stakes. Like, what would happen if my character doesn't overcome this conflict? And if your answer is that nothing would really happen and everything would stay the same, then your conflict probably isn't big enough. But if your answer is, if they don't overcome this conflict, then phew, their life will just be ruined and they will have all of these dire consequences, whether they're just internal or external, then you're probably onto a great conflict. And my last bullet point, and this one's a little bit harder to explain, but I encounter this a lot in kind of manuscripts I read from beginning writers, is that the characters sometimes will have unclear emotions, or they won't really understand why they're doing what they're doing. And if that's the case, it's really hard for the reader to buy in. A lot of times this is because you're in a fantasy story and there's some like magical guide that's like directing them to do all of these actions and maybe, you know, unravel this mystery, but they don't really understand the mystery or why they're unraveling it. And that can be really problematic because it's hard for the reader to buy into the story if the character doesn't even understand what's happening. So be careful about those 4 things when you are looking at establishing conflict in your story. Phew, hot seat.
That's awesome.
So now we're moving back to Sherry. Sherry's in the hot seat. This question is from Sophia. Do your books ever reflect yourself?
I think that all authors, we all go about our stories living our lives. And for me personally, I think that each story it has to be a piece of me in it somehow, whether it's a like, a dislike, something that I'm curious about, could be from my experiences, could be how some of my experiences I wish they had gone differently. You know, I think somehow it's a huge mixture of them all, whether you mean to or not. I think sometimes subconsciously. And for me, I think that sometimes I include characters who have characteristics that I would like to have, that I'd like to emulate, or that I admire, and vice versa. Characters who either people I've actually come in contact with in my life that I didn't like something about them, what have you. I remember in my the first draft of my young adult novel, there was a guy who, believe it or not, for some odd reason, I named him Dexter. I don't know why. And it wasn't until I finished the book and my best friend read the horrible first draft, but she came right out in this Dexter character. She goes, "Hey, this sounds like Bleep Bleep from high school." And I was like, "Oh, it's him." And I didn't realize that I had so I think that was a reflection actually of me, because this guy always bugged me because he was just kind of mean. And I always used to think, never said it, but is it something I'm doing why he's mean? And it probably wasn't. It's just who he is. But, so I think so. Like with Ebony, she's this good girl at heart, but she tries to be like rebellious on the outside. And that was something that I always wanted to be, but I didn't. And with Anna, she has like a really close, that's my main character from my young adult novel. She has a really close relationship with her dad, but she doesn't show it a lot. So there's a lot of push and pull in different scenes where she's alone, and you see a lot of more of how she feels about her dad. And that's me. I'm really close to my dad, but we have this kind of joking relationship where it's not. So I think it does bleed into me as an author onto the page. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, yes. So Sherry gets to stick right in that hot seat for a little bit longer and answer Everett's question. When did you first start writing?
I think like probably most of us, I think the spooky authors have answered this question before. I think a lot of us were either writing when we were young, or we were really interested in storytelling. Like whether it was, we would act out things with, I think it was Samantha Clark who talked about puppets and what have you. And I think I was the same way. My main thing was dance. I started when I was like 3, and that was a big way for me to tell stories, through music. And I'd find as I got older, I was geared to more doing it professionally, where eventually I wanted to do it professionally. So I think I used a lot of emotion. And once I was in high school, if things were going on, I would use that emotion. And then I used to write a lot of poems. I think that was kind of like a therapy kind of a thing when I was in junior high and high school. And then when I decided to I think it was before I decided to throw my hat in the ring about writing professionally. I was doing these little things they're like little pamphlets for high school, sports and stuff like that. And then I got a few short stories published in anthologies before I decided to throw my hat in the ring for a full novel, which I remember when I started, I didn't think that I was going to do that. But one important thing I just wanted to mention was, I think it was around my junior high age, maybe 12, 13-ish, I started journaling. I didn't know that's what I was doing. I would just rip pieces of paper out of my notebook, or maybe doodle during class and write things. And I started keeping them. And I think that's a great exercise to becoming a writer, and also to helping to hone how you can connect with your inner self to get it out in your characters. That helped me a lot.
Yeah, love it. Okay, this very last one. Why don't we just put all of ourselves in the hot seat? Yes, let's do it. This one is from Anna. And she asks, what genres of books or writing do you like other than spooky or mystery? So let's go to Sarah. What other genres?
Yeah, well, I mean, I read everything, like everything. I still love classics. I still read poetry. I read a ton of nonfiction because I think, like a lot of authors, nonfiction will lead me down rabbit trails that will become story ideas. So, you know, I might read an interesting article about a girl that started leaving food out in her yard for crows, and they've started like bringing her presents, right? Um, and then that may spur this whole idea that just snowballs, and I may end up reading like 5 nonfiction books on crows and like all the research people have done about them and how they're basically flying monkeys because they're brilliant and all these things, right? I read a lot of different genres. I actually read a lot of young adult because I tend to know a lot of young adult authors, and then I get really excited about the work they have coming out. I want to see it. But I read a lot of middle grade too, because it's funny how you don't, I don't think it's just because I write it, to be honest, because when I was a teacher and I wasn't writing middle grade, I was still reading middle grade because there are a lot of things about the way that middle grade tends to address good versus evil and like community and like hope that are still very relevant to me as an adult human being. And when I'm feeling kind of like demoralized or like things in life are difficult, I often find that reading middle grade and specifically reading fantasy and science fiction as genres tends to give me like really renewed energy and like interest in the world around me. And it spawns hobbies too, which is great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Sherry, what about you?
I agree with a lot of what Sarah said. I have those same motivations, and the nonfiction. She made a great point. That's what I do. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I have this thing with like obituaries, like looking for interesting,
Super brand, Sherry.
I know, like interesting names, and then when you learn about the people, it's kind of, I guess, it connects to like the thing that I had talked about before. When I was a kid, I used to like to walk around the cemetery and see the older stones and wonder who the people were, and then sometimes you could actually research and find them. Back then, it was harder. You actually had to go to a library. Now you can do things online, but and I read a lot. I started reading when I was kind of on the cusp of wanting to write. It was young adult. That's what I was really interested in reading. And the same thing with Sarah. I mean, I read a lot of middle grade, but I like the middle grade because of that whole good and evil and how kids can find themselves. But for me, I am also, my favorite is definitely spooky elements and all of that, but I am also a love sap. I love romances. I do. Mm-hmm. So that's my, and classics. I mean, like Wuthering Heights and Pride and Prejudice are like my favorite. I could read those over and over and over.
I still go back to Jane Eyre and I laugh while I read it
now.
Oh,
yeah.
Because there's some things about it that are ridiculous that I didn't catch as, a junior high schooler, but I still love it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. As far as reading, I do also read pretty much everything, like everything out there. I love all of it. I love middle grade for the sense of wonder, or like any kind of book that has that like kind of like really heartfelt sense of wonder and whimsy. So you feel so good when you read it, like you're kind of taken away to this delightful, happy place. I do love this. And when I'm reading, in addition to spooky and a lot of magical realism, Skeleton Tree definitely fits in that mold. And of course, there are so many definitions. There's like the classic definition of magical realism, and now it's kind of broadened out. So when you talk about it in middle grade, it has like a slightly different definition. But for me, it's like any book where you have this everyday setting with one hint of magic, just one touch of fantasy, and that fantasy element is usually what sparks and facilitates the character's emotional growth in the story. And I really love to write stories like that because I love to tell stories that are all about the character's emotional growth. But I also love fantasy and magic, so that way I can kind of combine those two. So it's kind of like putting realistic fiction and fantasy fiction together into one nice little mashup. And I also, one of my favorite adult authors who also writes middle grade is Neil Gaiman. And for the reason I love Neil Gaiman so much is that most of his stories are kind of like that, in the sense that he takes the everyday and turns it into something magical. And I really, really love any time that a story can do that. So yeah, that's just a little bit for me. And I think that we have addressed all of these questions that were left over. So thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Jerry. Woo!
That's awesome. Thank you.
I do this when I'm teaching all the time. High five to the camera.
Yeah, high fives all around. And if you are a teacher or a librarian out there, we have, I think we're at almost 14 or maybe even 15 authors now at spookymiddlegrade.com. And we are all middle grade authors, and most of our books have some kind of spooky element. But as you can see, like, books, they combine all genres. So we write spooky, but we just write books in general. And we would love, love, love to Skype or do a Google Hangout with your class. And those are 30-minute Q&As. Head over to spookymiddlegrade.com if you'd like to set one of those up. And then any leftover questions, we would be happy to answer them on our YouTube channel, just like we are today. So thanks, everyone. And a big shout out to the students at Avery Coonley School.
Hey, guys.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, everybody.